Welcome to the WanderLearn Show. I'm your host, Tapon. In this episode, I'll be reviewing the new documentary called Finding Satoshi. It's about Satoshi Nakamoto, the creator of Bitcoin. And in it, the producers of the documentary suggest that they have found Satoshi Nakamoto's identity. Stop this video right now if you don't want to hear who it is, because there will be spoilers in this. You can get the movie in the links below to see the whole movie. Spoiler alert, they conclude that it's Hal Finney and Len Sassaman who are together, collaborated, and were, as a whole, Satoshi Nakamoto. That's the movie's conclusion. This video is going to completely debunk that, and I'm going to actually use much of the documentary itself to prove that they came to the wrong conclusion. But before I get into all the details of that, let me start off by 3 compliments about the movie. First of all, beautifully shot, cinematography is very nice, excellent graphics, audio, just very well produced documentary, impressive. They spared no expense on that. Number 2, what I really like is that they came up with some great candidates for Satoshi Nakamoto, except for LaRue, which is this kind of a criminal guy, but they quickly discard him. So basically, solid candidates. No real fringe, kind of like scratching your head, what the hell did they come up with that with? No, good candidates. The third thing that they did well is that they criticize themselves. In other words, they poke holes in their own theories, which is something that Jon Callas of the New York Times, I felt didn't do as much in his article, which exposed Adam Back as Satoshi Nakamoto. So those are 3 things I like about the movie. Now I'm going to use the own movie as well as diving into my favorite book about this topic, which is called The Mysterious Mr. Nakamoto by Benjamin Wallace. Fantastic book. Together with the book and with the documentary, I'm going to show why the documentary is wrong. Let me tell you the biggest problem I have with the whole documentary. And this is where I think their fatal flaw, this is where they went wrong. They don't explain how they came up with their 6 candidates. Their 6 candidates are Adam Back, Nick Szabo, Hal Finney, Len Sassaman, Paul LaRue, and Wei Dai. Those are the 6 candidates. And the irritating thing about the documentary is that they don't tell you much about how they get there. All it is suddenly the chief investigator says, experts and journalists have narrowed down the field for us and told us, and we've come up with this list of 6. And right off the bat, I think that's where they went wrong, because they should have explained a little bit more how they weeded out all the potential candidates. Benjamin Wallace has 100 candidates in his book. He doesn't list all of them, but he goes through a lot more of the candidates and explains kind of the logic of how he narrowed things down. In this documentary, they don't explain any of the logic. It just seems like they did a comprehensive survey of various potential beings and potential people, and they probably looked for overlapping. Like this journalist says this. Oh, many journalists say Hal Finney. Let's put him on the list. Many people say Nick Szabo. Let's put him on the list. Which is an okay way, but to me, you're potentially missing somebody. But here's the really big problem I have. I think, this is my hypothesis, no basis on fact, but I believe the producers of the documentary said, you must pick somebody or a group. You are tasked. This is your job. You cannot end the document and say, we don't know, which, by the way, is how the Mysterious Nakamoto book, spoiler alert, ends. It's like he doesn't know. But that we don't know option was not an option for the HBO documentary. It was not an option for the one that Barely Sociable made on YouTube, who fingered Adam Back. It wasn't an option apparently for the New York Times either when they picked Adam Back. And that to me right there is a problem. You have to have the ability to say, we don't know. It's kind of like dark matter and dark energy in the universe. Just say, we don't know yet. That's a legitimate answer. We just don't know. Same thing with Deep Throat, who was fingered Nixon in the Watergate scandal. We didn't know until Mark Felt finally said, I'm Deep Throat. Okay, then we know. Here's the fundamental problem with this documentary. They had 6 candidates, and I believe that the investigators or the producers or somebody, they spent a lot of money on this. And to come out and say, well, we narrowed it down to 6, and guess what? It's none of these 6. Well, then what would have happened? The producer will say, well, keep looking. You got to give me an answer. They probably had a limited budget. They only had couple $1 million to spend or whatever it is on an investigation. And so they said, okay, we got to pick something. So what did they do? They put a lot of weight, and I don't blame them, on this one woman who narrows down the field by looking at their activities of when they're awake, when they're sleeping. They analyze about 5 candidates. They eliminate Adam Back, Nick Szabo, and Wei Dai. All 3 are eliminated simply because they're sleeping when Satoshi was awake, and when Satoshi was sleeping, they were awake. Basically, that's the summary there. So those people, there's not a clean overlap between, it's not even perfect. They're far overlap. So those are immediately eliminated. So take that New York Times, who thinks Adam Back is Satoshi. Well, they show you why Adam Back cannot be Satoshi. He simply doesn't make any sense. So that leaves them with just 2 candidates. And the problem is that neither one of them, neither Hal Finney, who wasn't a guy who write academic white papers and that kind of stuff, so that wasn't a good match. And then Len Sassaman did write white papers, but wasn't a good coder. So that's not a good match. So what do? They say, well, gee, married them together. Now we got the best of both worlds. And it also helps because there was a point in the documentary that points out a brilliant argument as to why it's not Hal Finney. He was running a 10-mile race when Satoshi Nakamoto was emailing back and forth with a guy named Mike, and I believe even sending Bitcoin while Hal Finney was running. So how do you explain that? Well, obviously it's not Hal Finney. Their answer? Len Sassaman was doing it. That's why. Len Sassaman was the voice of Satoshi, the writer. Now, it wasn't even a good stylometric match. Oh, no stylometric match? We'll solve that problem too. There's a scrambler. There's a stylometric anonymizer. Which, by the way, when you use that logic, almost anybody could become Satoshi. Because if your solution to why there's not a stylometric match is simply that they're scrambling their words, well then pretty much anybody, almost anybody could become Satoshi. Because it just depends on how much scrambling there's going on. Jane Puckett, who is a FBI agent who unmasked the Unabomber, was really great. She's at minute 50, and she talked about how Satoshi was an independent thinker and that there's no way to keep it private if it's more than one person. So she doesn't think it could be more than one person. And she said, I think correctly, that it was an intellectual exercise for Satoshi. Quote, there's no need for social affirmation, she said. And she also said he has no enthusiasm for money and that he's a modest person. I think she nails it. She's really good at profiling. And another irritating part of the documentary is that whenever things don't fit neatly, they go off to conspiracy theories and just wild, convoluted stories, and they forget Occam's razor, which is maybe the simplest explanation is best. Give you a few examples of this. Like, just imagine for a second that Len Sassaman had said, in his tweeted, like, Bitcoin's amazing, Bitcoin's great, I love you working on Bitcoin. Then he says, well, that proves that Len is a part of Satoshi because he's doing some rah-rah cheerleading of Satoshi. Case closed. Easy, right? That's a lot of proof, right? But inconveniently, Len Sassaman was bashing Bitcoin and saying it's a piece of shit, effectively. Sassaman said, quote, Bitcoin is an overhyped thing, unquote. It fails as a cyberpunk protocol. He said, quote, it suffers from the worst of both worlds, no strong anonymity, yet no fraud reversal protection, unquote. And so what do? They say, that's to disguise his real feelings for it. Hal liked to program in C. So why did he program Bitcoin in C++? It was to, quote, throw people off. Why did he insert a few things that were not typically his style? Again, to kind of like confuse people, to show that it's not him. But if it had been a perfect match, then they say, well, it's obviously Hal. In other words, tails I win, heads you lose. I mean, either way, it's so frustrating that they resort to these conspiracy theories. Same thing with stylometry, whether it's coding stylometry or prose stylometry. If the fit is not perfect, doing some stylometric anonymity is all you need to do to cover your tracks, and that's why there's not a perfect fit. So, blah, blah. Confirmation bias, one after another. They were left down. They had whittled away all these candidates and they were left down with 2 imperfect candidates. Instead of just saying, shit, it's neither one of these. Instead of agreeing with the experts that they had on their program, on their documentary, saying it's highly unlikely that it's more than one person. Instead of just saying, well, shit, it's none of these people. It must be somebody we're not even looking at. Instead of saying that, they said, well, it has to be these 2 collaborating together, which is a really kludgy solution. When Hal Finney's coding style doesn't match Satoshi's, simple solution. Well, he did a few extra things, changed the code a little bit to throw people off. Oh, God. Every single time, like when things don't have a match, oh, that was on purpose. Minute 58 of the documentary, Will Price, who's this guy who worked with Hal Finney, is convinced that Hal Finney was one of the creators of Bitcoin. And he says that, quote, RPow, which is something Hal Finney made up, is as close to Bitcoin as anything can possibly be. I'm like, no, it's not. No, it's not. And almost nobody agrees with that. Just to be as objective as possible, I asked Perplexity.ai, asked them, well, what do you think is the closest out of the following candidates? And then Perplexity says, out of the candidates you gave me, it says the closest overall Bitcoin-like design, number 1 is BitGold by Nick Szabo. Yes, of course. I've said that before. 2, B-Money. Number 3 is RPow. And number 4 is Hashcash, what is Adam Back. So by the way, Hashcash, which also the New York Times implies is so closely related to Bitcoin, it's the 4th place in this race of which one is the closest to it. And RPow, which Hal Finney made, is number 3 out of, you have 2 other candidates that are much closer to what Bitcoin was. So to me, Will Price just really destroyed his reputation when he said that RPow is as close to Bitcoin as anything can possibly be. I'm sorry, Will Price, you lost my respect for saying something which is clearly a false statement. Will Price says that he wasn't busy for about 2 months, and that happens to coincide when the Bitcoin white paper and the Bitcoin code came out. And then Will Price says, what was he working on? I think it was Bitcoin. He could have been working on many other things. He was learning how to code in Haskell. I mean, he did lots of different projects. The guy was a busy guy. It doesn't have to be Bitcoin. At the end of the movie, Will Price says that Hal was, quote, one of the creators of Bitcoin. And technically, I understand where he's coming from but it's the same way of saying, well, the person who invented the wheel was one of the creators of the automobile. Yeah, kind of. It is a component. So Hal Finney created RPow, which was, in a sense, a component of Bitcoin. And so he was one of the creators. It's true. But to me, that's really a stretch. You're really stretching because you want to champion this guy that worked for you, and you want to be able to say, I knew Satoshi Nakamoto because it was Hal Finney. To me, I don't buy Will Price's argument. Hal Finney's supporters sent 25 Bitcoins to Hal to help him with his ALS treatment. Now, if Hal is sitting on 1 million Bitcoin, why does he need people to donate 25 Bitcoins to him to help him with his ALS? It doesn't make sense. He obviously was not loaded and rich. And he certainly didn't have a stack of Bitcoin because he wouldn't need donations. It just doesn't make sense. Sometimes Occam's razor, if everybody's denying it, if it's quite clear and they're sincere people, you watch the documentary, you can see his widow, Fran, is so genuine. And she denies that Hal is Satoshi. Period. Simple. End of story. And I love how Benjamin Wallace debunks Hal Finney. He says, Hal Finney, in order to be Nakamoto, required that you fantasize an elaborate pantomime in which he created sock puppet accounts to send emails to himself, in which, despite having access to hundreds of millions of dollars, he didn't spend any of it on life-extending health care, or leave it to his family who would live on without him, or to a cause like ALS research, to which his Fran would soon devote herself, and in which he persisted in his ruse, even though, as he told me, I have little to lose by shedding my anonymity. It just doesn't make sense. At minute 105, Olivia Dillon, who's a VP of PGP, she said he wanted to change the world and he wanted a legacy. What greater legacy could you leave besides Bitcoin? It's one of the amazing legacy for a programmer. And he was certainly willing to take credit for it. Another article quoted in the book, they talked to Hal Finney's son, and he said, "My father was an honest guy. He would have loved to have been part of creating Bitcoin, and he wouldn't have hidden it. But he was not involved." At minute 61 of the documentary, they play a recording of Hal Finney, who says, quote, "I'm making this recording mostly because I want people in the future to hear my voice and maybe something of my story." Wow. So Hal Finney was a humble guy, but he wanted his story to be remembered. He wanted people to remember who he was. He wanted a legacy. And other people said that in the documentary, that Hal Finney wanted to have a legacy. And his own wife, his widow, said he wanted to change the world. If you're sitting there recording your voice because you want people to remember how you sound, and you just created Bitcoin, don't you want that to be part of your legacy? Don't you want to say that? And Hal Finney told his wife, when his wife asked him, Fran said, "Are you Satoshi?" Because a lot of people think that you're Satoshi. He said, "No, I'm not." And at the very end of the documentary itself says that Fran said that Hal Finney would never have lied to her. There are no family secrets. It says there in print at the end of the documentary. The documentary itself pulls itself apart and reveals that Hal Finney was not Satoshi Nakamoto. Then in the book of Benjamin Wallace, he asked personally whether he was Satoshi Nakamoto, and he said, quote, "I am not. I wish I had created something as potentially world-changing as Bitcoin. Under my current circumstances, facing limited life capacity, I would have little to lose by shedding anonymity, but it was not I," unquote. What more do you need to know? And then here's another great quote from the movie. Hal Finney told Jon Callas, quote, "Why would I deny that I'm Satoshi if I were Satoshi? I have a fatal disease. There's no reason in the world to deny that I'm Satoshi because I'm not going to be around for more than 2-3 years. And no, I'm not Satoshi." Okay, if somebody told you that, what would you think? Well, I'll tell you what Jon Callas concluded. It's a crazy conclusion. He said in the documentary, "At the time, quote, I interpreted that as a non-denial and I interpreted it as a yes." God. What? The guy just told you, "I'm dying. I'm going to be dead in 2 or 3 years. I have no reason to deny that I'm Satoshi. Therefore, I'm not Satoshi." And then you say, "Well, that sounds like a yes to me." Are you not listening? Fuck. Let's look at the final words of the documentary, which kind of prove it wrong. It says that the investigators confirm that neither of the widows, which Fran and Meredith, has the private keys to move Bitcoin. So, okay, how likely is it that both widows of Satoshi Nakamoto lack the keys? I mean, maybe one of them would have had it. They both had healthy marriages. It's not like the husband was vindictive and said, "You know what, I don't want to leave you with a fortune. I want to leave you poor and destitute." No, doesn't make any sense. The widows could be lying. They could be saying, "Oh no, they want to do it to protect their fortune." But neither widow is living the high life by any means. The coins haven't moved. Doesn't make much sense. And most of all, the investigators are confident that the widows are telling the truth. So, therefore, what happened to the keys? They don't explain it. That both Len and Hal Finney both somehow lost the keys. Both of them were keeping secrets from their dear beloved wives. Both of them? Really? It's just stretching the imagination. And the last word is Fran saying, and she probably insisted after seeing the documentary, saying, "I want you to make sure that the final thing that's in that documentary is that I do not believe that Hal Finney was Satoshi Nakamoto or really involved with it in any kind of deep way, a creator of it." So in the end, the very last words of the documentary say, "You know what? You just watched 2 hours. It's all bullshit. Sorry to waste your time." an email that I got from Benjamin Wallace, and he okayed my sharing it with you. First of all, he said that he had interviewed some of the same people that the documentary interviews. Specifically, he interviewed Jon Callas, who worked with both Sassaman as well as Hal Finney. He interviewed Meredith, the widow of Len Sassaman, and he also interviewed Will Price, who supervised Hal Finney. He said, when I first spoke with Jon and Will, I too had this thrilling eureka feeling that I had cracked the mystery. But alas, he says, there are too many confounding factors to remain confident in this theory. And he lists 5 factors. Number 1, Len Sassaman was very critical about Bitcoin, which the documentary observes many times. Len Sassaman bashed it. According to Ben Wallace, Meredith, his widow, said it was sincere. He really didn't like Bitcoin. He really criticized it. Now in the documentary, they say, well, that was just a fake persona. He was just doing that. But why would he do that with his wife, Meredith? Why would he lie to her? Or why would she perpetuate the lie? The second thing that Benjamin Wallace pointed out is that after Len Sassaman was dead, Satoshi Nakamoto sent out a message saying that I am not the Satoshi Nakamoto that Newsweek said it was. And it's unlikely that his email had been hacked by then. According to the documentary, they would probably say, well, that was Hal Finney who said that, because Hal Finney was still alive. Maybe, but this is Benjamin Wallace's take. Number 3, Jon Callas and Ben Lowry both told me that Sassaman wasn't a naturally modest person and likely to conceal his involvement in the creation of a revolutionary technology. In other words, Sassaman probably would have boasted, like, I did this. Number 4, both Callas and Bram Kuhn, the creator of Bitcoin and Sassaman's former roommate, both of them told me that they didn't think Sassaman had the technical chops to create Bitcoin. And again, the documentary answers that by saying, well, because he didn't do it, it was Hal Finney who did it. Okay. And finally, the 5th point that Benjamin Wallace says is that Sassaman wasn't a close hit on either prose or code stylometry. So those are the 5 reasons that Benjamin Wallace cites without having even seen the documentary. But I watched it twice, so I really dove into it carefully because I really wanted to give it a fair chance. One of the fatal flaws of the movie and their reasoning is right in the trailer. You can hear it. It says that it's not human nature to not touch the coins. And that reasoning pervades in the film, where if you look at it, how is it possible that Satoshi has all this money and nobody's touched it? Because Satoshi's dead. Simple, easy explanation. And to me, they didn't think about all the other possible explanations. That he lost the coins, that he'd purposely destroyed his hard drives for maybe operational security, not to be caught. Maybe the fact that he's still sitting on the coins and just waiting for the right moment. Maybe he's kind of like a monk. And there are monks in the world. They are real people. So you can't say it's not part of human nature. There's a small segment of society that wants to forego wealth. Maybe he will move the coins. Maybe it's for his inheritance. Maybe he's going to move it when there's a quantum threat. There's many other explanations than Satoshi's dead. That's a very simple explanation, and it's a very convenient one, but it's not the only one. And I think the producers of this documentary and the investigators felt that that was such a juicy, simple solution that they just gravitated to dead people as potential Satoshi candidates. And conveniently, 2 of them were dead. And so they said, oh, must be them. But they disregarded other possible explanations as to why the coins haven't moved. So what's my conclusion of all this? The documentary, while fascinating, engrossing, and fun to watch, and lots of interesting clues, well made, it's wrong. Just like the New York Times is wrong about Adam Back. I think it comes down to the fact that Benjamin Wallace, the guy I interviewed in my podcast, is right. Unfortunately right. We don't know who Satoshi Nakamoto is, and I'm starting more and more to believe what Benjamin Wallace came to the conclusion of by the end of the book, is that maybe it's nobody that we think of. It's nobody that we really know very well. And that's a frustrating answer, but don't believe this documentary. In fact, don't believe any of the documentaries so far. They all are unconvincing. What do you think? Were you convinced by the documentary? Did you watch it? I'll put a link down below with maybe a code to watch it for a little bit cheaper, and maybe it'll eventually come out on some other platform. This is Francis Tapon, encouraging you to wander and learn. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of this WanderLearn show. I am now using Substack.com to deliver my podcast and weekly newsletter, so please subscribe to my free Substack newsletter by using the link in the show notes. Or, if you've got a good memory, browse to ftapon.substack.com. Why ftapon? Well, it's my first initial and my last name. In fact, whatever social media app you use, including YouTube, if you search for ftapon, you'll find me, so connect with me. My website is also ftapon.com. Do you have an idea, question, or comment? Leave me an anonymous voicemail at speakpipe.com/ftapon. Lastly, become a WanderLearner by joining my paid subscriptions on Substack or patreon.com/ftapon. Wherever you join, I will reward you regularly. Tell your friends to subscribe to the WanderLearn show. If you review the WanderLearn show, I'll share your review on a future episode. This is Francis Tapon, encouraging you to wander and learn.